So this week's episode, we talked to a pretty awesome team.
Dr. Carole Joffe and David Cohen, who have written two really interesting books on abortion.
Their most recent book, After Dobbs, really provides a deep dive into the aftermath of the Dobbs decision. And I love how they set up the book because it's a series of interviews with about a dozen people that happened both before the Dobbs decision in the spring of 2022, immediately after the Dobbs decision, and then later in the year. So they kind of looked at, what was happening to people, what was happening to clinics, what was happening to the landscape of abortion care during that time, and how over this very short period of time, things changed pretty radically.
And they really do bring very different perspectives that enhance every chapter so you understand the sort of sociology, the medicine, the legal context. It's just a book in which you can learn a lot.
Right. And I think, with most dynamic duos, like each one of the pair brings something unique. So Carole's a sociologist, David's a lawyer and a law expert, and really the father of the legal theory around shield law protections, which is pretty cool. I learned a ton from our conversation with them. They know a lot about the history of abortion, what's going on currently, the current case law on abortion, and it's a fantastic conversation.
My name is Carole Joffe. I am a sociologist. However, I work in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, and I study abortion provision.
I'm David Cohen. I'm a law professor at Drexel Klein School of Law in Philadelphia. I have been a practicing lawyer for a couple decades, almost 3 decades now. And in that entire time, I've represented abortion clinics in Pennsylvania on a variety of legal and policy matters. And I continue to do that in litigation and policy matters in the state of Pennsylvania. And also I continue to work on some issues nationally as well, but mostly for the Pennsylvania clinics. In my academic work, I also study abortion provision, constitutional law, sex discrimination in the law, those kinds of things.
Welcome, both of you, to Outlawed, and thanks for talking with us. We wanted to start off by asking a question for both of you. David, maybe we'll start with you, but do you remember where you were and when you heard about the Dobbs decision?
Yeah, it was a Friday morning, 10 a.m. East Coast time. I had just finished an hour-long interview with a New York Times reporter about what might happen if Dobbs overturns Roe v. Wade. And I think we had literally gotten off the phone 2 minutes prior. And I did not think it was going to be that Friday for a variety of reasons. I thought it was going to be the next week. But we just got off the phone and I was checking the sites and it happened. So I was at my desk at home, having just had this wonderful conversation about all the complexities of the world that we might be seeing. And then boom, there it was. This was heartbreaking, even though we knew it was coming. There should be some German word for that, right? For when you're very sad and upset about something, even though you know exactly what you're about to face, right? It's one of those things that you feel like there's got to be a term for it.
Carole, how about you?
Well, actually, I had two moments I remember. A number of us in May, the previous May, were at the NAF meeting in Florida. And a bunch of us were on the plane going back to San Francisco. Somebody had their laptop open and saw the leak. So we all learned about the leak on that plane, which in some ways was good because we were with our community. I mean, we got off the plane and everybody cried together. So that was the leak. And then the actual days, since I'm on the West Coast, I was just waking up. I remember I was sort of stirring at around 7-ish, and my husband came in and blurted and, immediately turned on the TV. And like David, I knew what the decision would be. I didn't think it was going to be that day. And even though it's exactly like David, even though it was totally predictable, it was still devastating. I mean, and I should say, the most similar experience I ever had, given my age, is, I was a freshman in college when JFK was killed, and you always remember, I mean, those of us who were alive then, we all remember exactly where we were. And, and I remember exactly where I was here in my bed.
And at this point, you all had been working on the concept for this book already, though. You had done some interviews before the Dobbs decision with folks. And what's interesting is I feel like some people were surprised that this happened and other people really saw the writing on the wall for some time. And so I'm curious kind of how did you two end up starting to work on this book together, and how did you end up pairing together? And what was that writing on the wall that you saw?
So we had written a previous book, Obstacle Course, The Everyday Struggle to Get an Abortion in America. And that came out in 2020, like 3 weeks before the world shut down because of COVID. So we'd been working together for a long time. And actually, our partnership sprung from, I've been doing this a while, but not as long as Carole. And when I started doing some qualitative research, meaning interview-based research around abortion, we law professors, we don't have a PhD. We don't study methodology like people do in academic disciplines where you get a graduate degree around that discipline. We just get a law degree and then we become law professors. It's a strange thing. So the normal way law professors write articles, we read cases, we read a statute, and then we write about that, right? But I wanted to do something different with my work around abortion and looking at how abortion providers are harassed. And I had read some of Carole's work, some of her books, and I just emailed her out of the blue back in 2010. I said, I'm new to this field, at least this kind of work, and I really think your work is interesting, and I like the methodology. I'd love to talk to you about it. And Carole, being the generous person she is, she wrote me back, and she was a mentor to me early on in that work. And we struck up a friendship. And that's how we started working together on. And so this book really flowed out of our first book. Obstacle Course was about how when abortion was legal everywhere, it was still difficult because of the obstacles that states put in people's path. As we were talking about that book, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in September of 2020. We can probably all remember where we were when we found that out.
Yeah.
It was at that point that it was pretty clear to a lot of us that Roe was going to be overturned, right? Because she died, Trump replaced her with Amy Coney Barrett very quickly before the 2020 election. And that flip of who the justice was on the Supreme Court was pretty clear indication of what was going to happen. So that was sort of the moment that, for, as you said, the writing was on the wall, that Roe was going to be overturned. Because with Ginsburg on the court, there was the numbers were that it likely wasn't going to be overturned. But without her on the court, replaced by a conservative and Justice Barrett, the numbers flipped.
And then how we actually got to write together is, I'm the guest who invited myself to dinner. I mean, David sent me a proposal. I remember where I was at that time. This is a day of memories. I was in Vermont visiting my sister, and I get this email from him. Would you look over this proposal? And I looked it over, and this is good. So I wrote back as tactfully as I could. Look, I understand if you're saying no, but how would you like me to write this with you? So that's sort of how it happened.
It's important to understand that background precisely for the reason that this is a field that is so intertwined with law, and it shouldn't be. But abortion provision is so intertwined with law and the Supreme Court that you need to understand that at least a little bit to understand what's going on. And like I said, it shouldn't be. It should be like any other area of medicine where you don't need to understand who the justices are on the Supreme Court to know the best thing with respect to cancer care. But for abortion, you do. They had the Mississippi case, that is Dobbs, in the pipeline before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And we had we knew she had some health problems for 20 years, but we had we didn't know she was going to die in September of 2020. We didn't even know she was on the verge of death, right? So, but they had, the Mississippi passed that law in 2018. They appealed it to or maybe it was 2016. They appealed it to the Supreme Court in early 2020. So if she had not passed away, Dobbs would have just been another case. Maybe the Supreme Court wouldn't have taken it. But they had it there ready for that moment when they got the Supreme Court majority. They had a case there ready to overturn Roe. I'm afraid that if we ever get a Supreme Court majority that's pro-choice, we will not have set the stage for that moment and have it ready for the court to have a vehicle to overturn Dobbs. But we need to be doing that. We need to be planting those seeds, be in the position to pounce if we're ever in that position. I would love for that to be, 4 years from now, when we get a pro-choice president who appoints pro-choice justices to replace anti-abortion justices. It's more likely going to be 24 years from now than 4 years from now. But still, at that point, we need to be ready.
Here's where sociology kicks in. Social movements create social movements. And from the beginning, the abortion rights movement and the antis have been in this dialogue. Dialogue is a nice way of putting it, have been in this fight with each other. But part of the sauce, is, I think this work selects out particularly decent people, humanistic people.
But another thing that I know that several medical people in this field have talked to me about is that this is a uniquely satisfying form of medicine because unlike treating certain conditions where it's a lifelong management where you're trying to just, make sure someone can live in a way that is more comfortable, or, surgery where you have to keep managing it for a while afterwards. They might have to come back for more. That with at least your run-of-the-mill abortion, right? Someone can come in and you can change their life and cure that one medical issue in a very short period of time and be done with that. But certainly all of the other things going on in someone's life that may or may not have brought them to you that day, you're not addressing. But that one medical concern they have, with a first trimester procedure with 5 minutes, they're done. And there's this, to some of the people I've talked to, there's a real satisfaction with that practice of medicine that they do not find with other forms of practice of medicine.
One of the things I noticed in the book is something that we've noticed in our practice, which is that the doctors, the providers, the clinics in your book sometimes stand, 10 yards behind the line in terms of where the law could be. So there's the example that you give from Utah, where the clinics, the clinic on the Idaho border stops doing medication abortion because they're concerned that patients would take the pills into Utah, have them there, and that would be too much legal liability for the Utah providers. And that is restricting, the effect of that is restricting abortion beyond what the extent of the law would be. And I'm curious why that might be the case. Why aren't people pushing things a little more? I mean, I think people are following the law, right? And following the law more than following the law. And I wonder why that is.
It's a complicated question because risk assessment is very individual. Because as much as you may feel that as a movement we should take more risks, right? The individual taking the risk is the one who may wind up in jail or may lose their license or lose the job that's supporting their kids and their partner. And especially the doctors who have lots of years of training and probably lots of debt for medical school. And now you can't earn the living that allows you to pay off that debt. But that is not true for everyone. And I think there are a lot of people out there who are pushing boundaries. I think of it in the context of states with abortion bans, but with exceptions, right? If you have a patient who goes to a hospital, say in Texas, and has a terrible experience, some of the ones we've all read about, and doesn't get the care and suffers consequences, maybe even, dies, right? You get articles written about that person. But if you have someone who has an emergency, who goes to a hospital in Texas, an emergency room, and the doctor cares for that person, and provides the care that's needed, the abortion, no one's writing an article about that, right? Because just like you don't write an article about or talk to the media about the patient that you see, that you provide any other medical care because of HIPAA, because that person wants to get on with their life. You want to get on with your life as a doctor. So the care that is being given, that is pushing the boundaries, doesn't attract the same media attention.
Yeah, and I mean, let me just say the obvious, that pre-Rose, some doctors did get convicted. Only a handful actually spent time in jail, usually a couple of years. Most people who were jailed were non-physicians who did abortions. Fast forward to now, life in Texas, 99 years in Alabama, So, I mean, that puts it in perspective.
I think one other thing to comment about this idea of risk is that not only are there all the factors in terms of, an individual thinking about the consequences for themselves, but also just different people have different personalities, right? In terms of risk assessment, right? Like, do you like to go bungee jumping, or do you rather, does that scare you in ways that you'll just like, I'm never going to take that risk, right? So there's just sort of a personality thing that goes into risk assessment too, that is not really susceptible to reason, that I think we have to realize that that's going on too. Like, we have people in the movement who are just as committed to the same goals, who just have different appreciation or reactions to risk in their lives.
But we're talking as if this is only an individual decision. The good doc wants to do the procedure. No anesthesiologist will cooperate. No nurse will cooperate. The hospital council says no. So even if you are willing to take that risk, it's a collective process.
I'm curious about your thoughts about any cases that are coming down the pipeline, and maybe any reactions to the CPC case that's being heard in front of the Supreme Court. Just like, can you pull out your crystal ball and maybe prognosticate for us?
Probably the most important case that's in the pipeline is the case that's challenging the FDA regulations over mifepristone, the first of the 2-drug regimen for medication abortion. This case has been in federal court now for 3 years, and it was November of 2022. This anti-abortion group of doctors, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, sued the FDA, claiming that it improperly approved the drug in the first place, which was in the year 2000, and that the regulations that have, attached to the drug, the restrictions that are attached to this drug that are different than almost every other drug out there, are too lenient. So even if it was properly approved, it's too lenient in how providers can prescribe it. In particular, the allowance for telehealth and mailing abortion pills. So this case was filed in November of 2022, as I said. It has already gone to the Supreme Court once, and the Supreme Court said that this group of doctors was not the right not the right people to challenge the law. But 3 anti-abortion attorney generals from Missouri, Kansas, and Idaho have continued the case. The case was originally filed in Texas. It's now been moved to Missouri because Texas isn't involved in the case. But they're basically still making the same claims. They're saying, okay, maybe that group of doctors didn't have standing. They weren't the right people to challenge the case. But we, these 3 states where we feel that we are being injured by medication abortion, we want to challenge what the FDA has done here. And the reason I say this is probably the most important one is because, as probably most people listening to this know, the overwhelming majority of abortions in this country are done through medication abortion. Last data we have was 63% in 2023. It's probably much higher now. And then 25 to 20, I think the most recent data is 27% of medication abortions are through telehealth. And importantly, for people in banned states, abortion shield providers are mailing pills because the FDA allows for mailing of pills to those people in those states. So if the regulations were to go back and say you can't mail pills, or even worse, if say that this drug is not properly approved, that would drastically transform abortion provision in this country. And, you know, this case is in federal court, which means as it progresses, it will go to the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court takes the case, and we've got a conservative Supreme Court. So this case does worry me. I do think that the states have problems being plaintiffs in this case. I don't think they've really been injured. So I think we could see this case drag on for procedural reasons again. But that is probably the most important case out there. There are other cases. I think there's a North Carolina case and a West Virginia case that raised the same question about that's sort of from the other side, which is that the FDA has approved this drug. So states shouldn't be able to ban it or restrict it, because normally when the federal government acts, it preempts, means it overtakes state law. And the FDA has approved this drug as safe and effective. And the whole point of drug companies going to the FDA to get this approval is that they are doing the research, they are doing the legwork to show that this drug is safe, and then they can get a nationwide approval of this drug and then market it around the country. That's the point of the FDA regulating this rather than every individual state regulating it, right? So the idea that states can now ban this drug that has been approved by the FDA, I think personally that should be preempted. And there is a case, like I said, out of North Carolina raising this. There's another case out of West Virginia raising this. And so I think those are important cases that could expand access. Now, go to this U.S. Supreme Court, that's an uphill battle, but I think those are important cases too. The Crisis Pregnancy Center case involves New Jersey trying to look into whether the fake abortion clinics, the crisis pregnancy centers in those states in New Jersey are deceiving their donors, because widely recognized that they peddle a lot of fake science, or not even science, just fake talking points about abortion. And the New Jersey Attorney General, in its investigation into these clinics, has subpoenaed the donor list for these fake clinics under the idea that maybe we should talk to the donors to find out if they're being deceived, that they're donating to a deceptive institution. The crisis pregnancy centers have challenged this as a violation of their First Amendment rights, because they say that there's going to be a chilling effect on our donors. They're not going to donate to us if they feel like they're being investigated. And the Attorney General says, I'm not investigating the donors, I'm investigating you, and I want to talk to the donors to find out what they know and what they think. But the Supreme Court today, when we're recording this, which is December 2nd, this morning, the Supreme Court heard oral argument in this case. And so it'll probably take another 4 to 6 months before the Supreme Court decides. The initial reviews were pretty mixed, that the challengers, the crisis pregnancy center lawyer, did not do a good job really explaining to the court how exactly it was harmed. But at the same time, the justices seemed like they want to rule in their favor because they like crisis pregnancy centers. They don't like abortion. So I don't know how this case will come out, but it's certainly worth watching. The court has been has looked favorably upon fake clinics in the past. So I think chances are they'll probably win again, but I don't think we know that for sure after oral argument today.
Obviously, the shield laws have been really important, and one pathway through which people have received pills is through telemedicine, right? So seeing a provider either synchronously or asynchronously at a clinic that's in a state where it's legal to provide abortion, and then having the pills mailed to them. Another pathway is that people just order pills through organizations that are selling pills online. It's hard to understand what the sort of the legality of that, and it may vary state by state, but how that works. And I wonder if that's something you could help us understand a little bit.
Yeah, and I think there's a third way people are getting pills, which is that there are these informal networks of just community activists who are getting their hands on pills, either through importing them through other countries or advanced provision. and distributing the pills free of charge to people in their communities who need them. And that is probably the delivery method we have the least information about in terms of the quantity, but I've heard some numbers that are quite large and surprising in terms of how many pills are being distributed that way. Look, the state, let's just say, we'll talk about Alabama, right? Alabama bans abortion, with just, small number of exceptions. Alabama will look at any of these forms of abortion pill distribution as illegal in that state. So if you are, just a member of a community network dropping off pills for a friend, they will consider that illegal. That's a legal provision of abortion. If you are a doctor licensed in New York and practicing under your New York license, you are present in New York, and you are mailing pills to a patient in Alabama, you may be doing everything in compliance with New York law, because New York has a shield law that allows you to do that. But Alabama still looks at what you're doing as illegal. The international pharmacies are a little different because it's hard to get jurisdiction over an international pharmacy. And if the pills go directly to the person taking the pills, no state law criminalizes that person as violating the abortion law. They may get charged with some other crime, but not an abortion crime. But the problem is that it's hard to prosecute someone who's in another state with a shield law because they're protected from extradition. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that doctors in states with shield protection are so far being shielded, just like the name of the laws designed, from any consequences in these other states. Now, that could change somewhere in the future. There are court cases on some of these issues that we are, lots of people are closely following, but it has not deterred shield providers. The shield numbers keep going up every month, it seems. But to be clear, as much as New York does not see what the doctors are doing as illegal, Alabama absolutely does. And it's just, how can Alabama enforce that? And it's proving very, very difficult. I think the reason why it's sort of hard to wrap your head around is because you're wrapping, it's sort of the nature of federalism in our country, which different states with different laws, and that's okay. And that one state sees what you're doing is fine, another state sees what you're doing is illegal. But how do they actually make that happen? The consequences for the illegal action, that's difficult. And so that's where we are with all of this.
Carole, I'm curious, in writing this book and hearing all these stories, if there were any stories in particular, any people's experiences in particular that were surprising or stood out to you. You've been doing this work for decades.
I mean, I knew that these were extraordinary, dedicated people. I mean, it was no shockaroo that the abortion providing community would rise to the occasion. And I should tell you, my father was a doctor, not an abortion provider. He was a cardiologist. Extraordinarily humanistic person. When I was literally 5-6 years old in the 1950s, he took me with him on house calls. So at a very early age, my little 5, 6, 7-year-old brain, was imprinted with what it means to be a doctor who really cares about his patients. And then, fast forward 40 years or so, and now I'm seeing the same thing, with abortion providers who so deeply care. Anyway, all of which is to say that it was deeply moving to me to talk to providers who could no longer do this work, people whose life work this was, and who couldn't do it anymore. I mean, that was heartbreaking.
So one thing we ask all of our guests is, in this moment that is very challenging, what is giving you hope? And we can start with Carole.
Not to be too schmaltzy, but the work that you two are doing. No, I mean, just the creativity, that we're seeing. Okay, you can't do it in North Carolina. After a certain time, you go to Virginia. Tammy Crowenmaker, who we profile in our book, couldn't do it any longer in North Dakota, so she goes across the river to Minnesota. I mean, just the shield laws. I think the most recent data from the We Count project of the Society for Family Planning, was 15,000. Is that right, David? 15,000 a month. So what gives me hope is that abortion's never going to go away, and people will always find creative solutions.
Yeah, that's absolutely the same thing with me. I mean, the resilience and the resistance of the abortion providing world and the abortion supporting world and the abortion patients themselves. Look, it's a story as old as time that people who don't want to be pregnant will find a way to be unpregnant. We're seeing it, and we're seeing it in the face of messaging from the Supreme Court and politicians, and even sometimes our movement, that abortion has, the Supreme Court has ended everything, and it hasn't. And I think that message is a part of how abortion providers work, which is that they do not have to follow the lead of the Supreme Court, right? They'll follow the law when they think that, work around it sometimes, but they will not let the Supreme Court dictate what they do. And I think that's an important message more generally, right? That the Supreme Court doesn't decide what people do on the ground, and people can find ways to resist and work around that. And we documented that in the book. We keep seeing it every day. And I think that is such an important thing, and it gives me hope. And then the other thing, and this touches on some of the things we've talked about earlier, every day that the Trump administration doesn't do some of the things that it could do around abortion gives me more hope, because, they've had, looking at my calendar here, they've had 10 and a half months to further restrict mifepristone, to start prosecuting under the Comstock Act, and they haven't. They've done all sorts of things that I think are crazy and illegal and unconstitutional and unpopular, but they haven't done these things. And I think every day that goes by makes it less likely that they are going to. And maybe this is where my optimism comes in, because I know that there's some people who think every day goes by makes it more likely it's going to happen tomorrow. Whereas I think every day that goes by is an indication that they're telling us who they are by what they do, which is that this is not their priority right now for a variety of reasons. And especially as we get closer to the midterms and then closer to 2028, every day that goes by gives me hope that they are not going to pull some of the levers that I'm scared that they could pull.
Opinions expressed on this podcast are our own. Philanthropy keeps this podcast ad-free. To donate, you can find a link in the show notes.
This podcast is executive produced by us, Dr. Bev Gray, Dr. Jonas Swartz, and Jane Marie. Production by Little Everywhere. Thanks to Nick Thorburn, Patrick Ford, and Maker for our score. And extra special thanks to Carole, Joffe, and David Cohen, who lent their knowledge and voices to the show today.
Email us at outlawedpodcast@gmail.com.